Welcome to New Realities. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and I always like to do programs that are current, that affect us on a consciousness level. I think there's nothing more in the public's consciousness than what's being called a pandemic, and I'm talking to, I would say, an expert, someone who's looked at germs, the history of germs, has written a book called The Gospel of Germs. Nancy Toms is a distinguished professor at Stony Brook University, a distinguished history professor, and specializes in public health. But I just saw her lecture the other day, which I thought was really fascinating and important. So I wanted to invite her here. Thanks, Nancy.
Oh, happy to be here, Alan.
Before we get into the whole germ thing, can I ask you a separate question?
Sure.
What is an existential threat? Because I hear that word thrown around about environment. How do you define that?
I think of it as a threat to our very existence as a species. And one thing that I'm missing in a lot of the pandemic coverage is the environmental context. This is part of a more general set of problems we have because of the way humans interact with other species. That's the wet markets, and that's where these new novel viruses basically originate. So that I think that's it's part of an existential crisis that we're facing on the planet. In my
Existential meaning what, though?
When I hear that, I think of the capacity for mass extinction. So it's certainly a threat to us as individuals. I don't want to get sick. You don't want to get sick. But I think a lot of the anxiety, but also the opportunity in this moment is to think more deeply about what we're facing and what we need to change about the way we live.
Well, let's go there first right off. I mean, we could build up to that, but what do we need to change and what do we need to think more deeply about?
Let me put it I'll do it in levels. I think on a day-to-day basis, when I look at what's happening, I think it's really important that all of us stay calm, that we don't panic, that we choose what voices to listen to very carefully, and that we follow the basics of social distancing. So as you heard me talk about on Tuesday, what we're being asked to do today in terms of moderating certain kinds of interactions is classic public health technique, and it's been used for at least a century. That if there's a very contagious new disease coming around, you try to moderate its spread by things like hand washing and being careful with the way we sneeze on each other, etc. So that's one level of response that I think is very important. We need to get through this crisis, and it is a real crisis, both in terms of public health and the economy as well. But I'd say then another layer of response needs to be, how do we keep this from happening again? How do we do better with a challenge like this?
Do we keep this from happening again? You mentioned wet mark and all that interchange, but how would we keep from having, when we get through this, we need to prepare?
Yes. So I'm speaking here less as a historian and more as a citizen of the world who is very concerned about environmental change. And if you read the public health literature about why we are having so many more of these new pandemics, I mean, this is just the latest in a long string. You can go back to HIV/AIDS, and the diseases are very different, but what they have in common is a disruption of the environment and also the interactions between people and animals, but also population density. So it may be that this kind of trading of viral material between humans and animals has been going on for centuries and may have resulted in other new diseases. But we're much more aware of it now because we're more interconnected. We're there's so many more of us, population growth, and we're also encroaching on new parts of the environment that may be putting us in contact with new disease agents.
Doesn't it seem like every 100 years there's one of these things happening? I mean, in research for this, I looked at 1664. Isaac Newton had to leave
Yes,
London because of the Black Plague, and so this is just maybe something humanity has to face every as part of a cycle.
you're certainly absolutely right to point out that these massive pandemics with huge die-offs is not new to the 20th century or the 21st century. And, we can go back to ancient times and find that plagues, we're not sure what they were, but, played a major role in the decline of the Roman Empire. So you're right about that. I'd still say if you look at the frequency of new diseases emerging, that public health experts are worried because the pace has been picking up. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I've been talking about the environmental, but others is just travel. We travel more quickly. Back in with the classic, the bubonic plague in the 14th century, it took a long time to move because travel was slow. In the Spanish influenza, we had steamships and trains, so it moved a little quicker. Now we have airplanes, and a sick person can get on the plane in Beijing and be in San Francisco before they even know they're sick. So it's a pace question.
Which is what happened. There was a guy from Wuhan, China, who went to Washington State. He
Hmm.
was infected, and boom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I mean, so anyway, but I mean, in terms of like overall germ and all this, this is not as risky as the Black Plague.
Yes, I absolutely. And when I said before, I think it's important that we calm down a little bit. We need to recognize that this is a very communicable new coronavirus, but it's not deadly for the vast majority of people. It, the number I just heard a doctor at Stony Brook quote was 80% of us would have it and it would be a minor, relatively minor illness. The 20% that may have a more serious encounter are going to be people who have underlying health problems that make any infection hazardous. And we know who those groups are, very, very young, very old, etc. So this is not as bad as the bubonic plague. No way. That was a really, much higher death
Is it
rates.
as bad as the Spanish flu?
No, and we're not really sure why the death rate was so high from that particular, the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. One school of thought is that it was a mutated form and thus more deadly. Others have argued no, it was the context, the fact that people were stressed out and malnourished from World War One,
Right.
that made it so lethal.
Just one thing about the Spanish flu, you said in your talk it had nothing to do with Spain.
Yes, right. So, I mean, it was a war. There was a war on, and there was informal and formal censorship of what newspapers would put in their in their columns. And the countries that were at war tended to be more cautious about what they were saying, at least initially. But Spain was neutral. It did not. It wasn't on either side. And so when the news started coming out of these troop military outbreaks, they reported it, and Because they were the first ones to do it, it got nicknamed the Spanish flu.
Oh, I get it. So Spain was the first one to really report it, and then everyone told.
A bad nickname. I guess the moral of the story is here, don't be the first person.
Since I saw you, so much has come into place, like
Yeah.
closing schools, Broadway, and travel restrict. Is that extreme in this case and unnecessary, or you feel like as part of public policy that's a good thing?
I think it is a good thing. I will admit, even initially, having read all about the Spanish influenza and the tight control over it, that I wondered if it was really necessary to be so quick and so extreme. I mean, in just in a space of days, my university basically decided to go to online teaching. But the more I've tried to educate myself by listening to the public health experts who've advised this, is I understand better what they're trying to do, and that is to flatten the curve, as you keep hearing, and I'm sure your listeners do as well. We're trying to avoid having our healthcare system overwhelmed by very sick people all at the same time. So I've kind of, I think we're all kind of inclined to be resistant to expert authority and to ask questions. And that's a good, that's a very necessary trait. Sometimes I say to myself, you just have to listen to what they're telling you to do and do it. It's not life-threatening to me to shut down for a month. In fact, I'm trying to get my head around it, accepting authority and kind of saying, okay, I'm not going to try to second guess Fauci. He's telling me to do this. It makes sense to me to kind of accept that there are people out there trying to plan here who know a lot more than I do. And what am I giving up? I'm giving up some of my personal freedom and personal comfort. I'm a privileged person because I have I have the material ability to do that. I'm more worried about the implications of this for the vulnerable members of our society. So it's like I don't want to start whining and complaining, oh, you're making me stay home. I'm much more worried about, oh, what are we going to do about the big homeless populations that the coronavirus could just sweep through? Or, oh, please don't let it get a toehold in our huge prison system. I mean, that could be really ugly.
Mm. Well, I have to say, as an historian, you must be very excited because this is history that we're living through. But on the other side of that, because you've studied this, what would you do? What kind of ideas policies would you put in place?
The policies are already there. So I think what's so frustrating for historians like myself who've tried to work with public health policymakers and kind of provide a body of informed knowledge is we already know what we need to do, but we don't follow through. So, there has been a tremendous effort, at least since 9/11, to develop a plan for a pandemic, and to then be able to roll out that plan in a orderly fashion. That has completely fallen apart.
Well, what would that plan be? Do you know what the plan is? I mean, that they developed.
It's similar in a way, I would say, to where some of the governors and states have gotten to, which is in pandemic preparedness. It's very important that you early on be able to set up a way of finding people who are sick and isolating them. So one of the most standard principles is you need to, once you see it coming, develop a test and make that test available. So pandemic preparedness 101 is you want to be able, the minute a new one shows up, to hit the ground running and make testing easy and widespread.
But there is no test. A friend of mine had all the symptoms on Facebook. She mentioned this, and she said she could not find a place to get tested.
That's what I'm saying, Alan. That's the problem. The tests were not made available, and that should have been part of our national pandemic preparedness. Other countries did a much better job than we did of having getting the test kits out. So this is a major black eye to American preparedness, and I hope that there will be a nonpartisan attempt to look at what fell apart here. I'm very pessimistic that it will happen. Because everything has become so politicized. But we could have done much better.
What do we do now that we have this? And what do we do? Like, I mean, yeah, that was a problem and too bad. But now we're in this. And now what do you think?
It's clear that the message has been received that they need to make the test kits more available, and from what I'm hearing, they are going to be more widely available in probably the next couple of weeks throughout the country, and that will allow people to be tested more quickly than what we've been able to do. The reason you want to do that is you want people who have the virus and could spread it to others to stay home. And so that's what we need to do is test, stay home. In the meantime, the fallback is the social distancing, the make people stay at home, go to online teaching, close down the school system until we can really identify who's carrying it and isolate them. We all have to act like every encounter we have on the street, maybe with somebody with coronavirus.
Right. So let's talk about how this compares to what you studied, the Spanish influenza in 1917, 1918. Is it true that it affected 1/3 of the world's population?
I don't know what the world population was in 1918, 1919. I know the current estimates are that probably 50 million people had it.
How many would you say died of that out of that 50 million?
That's 50 million deaths.
So
yeah, in terms of the mortality rates, quite high for influenza. It was an influenza, not a coronavirus.
What's the difference, actually?
It's a different kind of virus. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of viruses. HIV is a virus. They all have their little family, differences. And what all viruses have in common is that they mutate quickly, and that's one reason that they tend to be so difficult for us to prevent and treat, because they're always mutating.
So that was probably a lot more dangerous and fatal, perhaps, than what we have now. But is it true it affected people 20 to 40 years old mostly?
Well, not entirely. It also affected young and old as well. But it was unusual as regular influenza, the kind that would come around every year. I mean, they were very familiar with influenza in 1918. The milder annual forms would not have seen that death rate of young people. So that's one thing that made it stick out so much.
Also reading about that, I read that people would wear these camphor type necklaces around them breathing. Is that true? I mean, what did people do then that they're not doing now or should do now?
I haven't seen the reference to the camphor necklaces. It certainly wouldn't surprise me. But They definitely used gauze face masks. Um, this by 1918, the concept of the germ theory was well established, and the wearing of masks by surgeons in surgery had become standard practice because they were aware of how many germs that were on your skin, in your mouth. Um, they used gauze masks. From a modern day perspective, we doubt that they did much because the influenza virus could was small enough; it could go through the gauze. You have to have much finer masks to prevent them. But maybe it did a little good. The other preventive techniques would be very familiar to your listeners. It was be very careful how you cough and sneeze and spit in public. They spit a lot more in those days, I think, than we do now. And use your handkerchief. Today, we're told to sneeze into our elbows, into our clothes. That's because we don't use handkerchiefs anymore, or use a paper tissue. One of the things I found fascinating was really, I think the influenza helped establish the popularity of using paper tissues to blow your nose in the 1920s. That's really when the Kleenex revolution takes off in this country.
Well, maybe it'll be the comeback of the handkerchief here in this. I'm interested in the history of germs and your book, the Gospel of Germs, because we didn't even know about germs up until the 1800s. I mean, tell me about that evolution of there were these invisible things. I'm sure people didn't believe they existed. So how did that whole idea of germs come about?
It's such an interesting story. Even though the concept of a microbe as a disease agent that could make you sick was not widely accepted until 1870s and 1880s, people understood that some diseases seem to spread from person to person. The classic being smallpox. It was clear if you were exposed to it, if somebody walked in the room with smallpox, a lot of people were going to get smallpox. So they understood that some diseases were catching, that somehow they moved from person to person. They also understood that those kind of very contagious diseases, that some of whatever the infective material could get onto objects. You've probably heard the smallpox and the blanket.
Native Americans, yes.
Yeah, and that is a true story. They did try to do this.
That actually got on. They didn't have a concept of what was it about that that transferred.
They didn't envision what they were transferring as a virus. So they knew that there was some kind of thing that could one person could give to another through close contact, or that somebody could leave like a deposit on an object that then, if somebody shared it, they could get sick. The idea that what that was a living member of nature, a microbe. We're not really sure you should say viruses are alive. They're so primitive that they're not alive. And I mean, even a bacteria is more alive than a virus.
The difference between a virus and a bacteria is what you mentioned that in class, the relative size. Just give us the difference.
A virus is a kind of bit of RNA, DNA that inserts itself into your cells and commandeers the machinery to replicate itself. So it does grow. In that sense, it feels like it's alive. You get one virus, it inserts itself into your cells and then multiplies. A bacteria is a single cell organism and more complex than a virus. can do extreme damage by, again, getting inside your body and kind of replicating itself and creating toxic byproducts. So that's what ends up making you sick with bacteria.
So in the history of germs, what happened?
So there's a theory that these infective particles are alive. I mean, you can find some people kind of hypothesizing that even in ancient times, but when it really starts to become a serious scientific possibility is through the work of Louis Pasteur. I mean, you've heard of pasteurization. What he got interested in ferments. In the beer and the wine industry, the beer that if the wrong ferment got into your mix, it would ruin your beer or your wine. And so he was hired to kind of look into what was causing these problems. And he discovered that there was something in the air that was falling in or getting incorporated into the brew that was causing the problems. And if you could keep that out, you wouldn't have that problem. So he started this whole process of trying to isolate what it was that was the agent of the ferment, and he hypothesizes that it's a living organism. You can't see it, but it's yet. But maybe you can see it eventually under a microscope. The person who really takes the germ theory into real scientific certainty was not Pasteur, but a German physician named Robert Koch. So he starts his work in the mid to late 1870s, and I'm pretty sure his first big discovery is either 1878 or 1879. He isolates the bacteria responsible for wound infection. So if you have a cut and this bacteria gets into your wound, you get gangrene. It's really bad. But once he had his method down, oh, I'm sorry, it may also have been anthrax was the first one. Anthrax is a huge bacteria, so it's not surprising that was the one they found the first because it's gigantic. But once they get going, I mean, Koch himself, once he gets his method down, he isolates cholera, tuberculosis.
How did he do that?
I don't know if you ever took your bio class. I remember doing this where you would have the plates of agar or a medium. So he created a sterile medium, and then he would take matter from a sick person
and cultivated petri dishes.
Exactly. He basically, it's the concept of the petri dish. And what he would do is over and over again, he would keep purifying the culture until he could see under his microscope he had one bacteria. And then he would create a pure culture of that bacteria, and he would show that he could give the disease to a well creature. He used rabbits, rats. It was larger animals in the beginning. So cholera, very familiar epidemic in the 19th century, spread in the water supply. He showed that what was in the water was the cholera vibrio. It's a particular kind of organism, and that you only got cholera when the cholera vibrio was in the water. So it was a level of specificity about what's causing the disease. Before that, they had a much more, I don't know how to describe it, but a kind of atmospheric theory of what caused epidemics. You probably heard of miasma, that would get particular weather patterns and soil patterns, and cholera would just, spark up. And what Koch showed is, nope, it doesn't just spontaneously generate It gets transported into the water supply. It may be able to kind of have a reservoir, so offline for a while, but it will come back in. That was the brilliance of what he showed, was specific germ, specific disease.
So that must have really helped public health. Of course, then he could develop treatment and avoidance behaviors.
It was better for prevention than it was for treatment, even though as soon as this new approach became accepted, scientists started trying to use that knowledge to create vaccines and chemotherapies. That proved to be very, very difficult, and it's really not until, I mean, there are a few breakthroughs in terms of a diphtheria antitoxin. They develop a really nasty kind of treatment for syphilis, which they discover is, a microbial disease. But the protection today that we have against bacterial infections from antibiotics, that didn't come until really the late 1930s. Sulfa drugs, and then penicillin in the 40s, and then lots of antibiotics come online in the
And that was
1950s.
huge. That saved millions, the hundreds of millions of lives.
And it also kind of made us uh, feel more confident that we didn't need to worry about public health, at least in preventing against infectious diseases. You see a lot of casualness kind of creep in the 1960s and 70s. I remember it well. I was there. That casualness about, if I get sick, I'll just take an antibiotic. But the HIV/AIDS epidemic really knocked that confidence.
Because you can't treat a virus with an antibiotic.
What you can treat are the secondary bacterial infections that often follow on a viral infection. Like in the Spanish flu, a lot of people actually died from pneumonia, which they got after the influenza, but they didn't have any antibiotics. Today, if you get a secondary infection, you can take an antibiotic, and that will help you.
Are there any treatments for viruses at all?
Well, not for the coronavirus. There's been some huge breakthroughs in antiviral treatments for HIV/AIDS, but I'm hearing now there may be a breakthrough that they can actually get rid of it. But up until now, what you do is you keep it from replicating. You can't get rid of it. You just put a lid on its multiplication. And that's the treatment that has allowed so many people who have HIV to live much longer lives than they did when the epidemic first broke out.
But with something like this viral thing, the body's own natural response,
Yeah,
in a healthy person will do what?
the kind of immunity that you're going to get is going to vary from virus to virus. With HIV, it overwhelmed your immune system. That was what made it so nasty, is it took your immune system offline. With the coronavirus, if you have a healthy immune system, it's going to eventually disable the attacker, and you will have immunity from at least this particular strain. I don't think they really quite know yet. This is a novel coronavirus, so they don't quite know everything about it yet. Whether or not, if you have it now, you won't get it again next year.
But let's go back to Pasteur, because everything sort of starts with him.
Is certainly part of a cleanliness revolution. It predates the germ theory. There were people like Florence Nightingale already realizing that a clean hospital, people were more likely to get well than a dirty hospital. You may have heard about Semmelweis. He's the doctor who first said that physicians needed to wash their hands. I think that's like 1843, maybe.
That was a revolution in medicine, right?
Oh, it was, but he was, the pioneer who was not appreciated in his own time. He did not believe, he didn't yet have the germ theory concept. That wasn't how he was explaining what he was seeing. He just noticed that medical students and doctors in hospitals, if they went straight from dissecting a body to learn anatomy and went to deliver a woman in childbirth, that the women were getting this terrible childbed fever. They basically were taking, yeah, it's horrible. And so he said it was a Viennese hospital, he said, don't do that. Wash your hands with some kind of disinfecting, whatever, I forget, chlorine, whatever. And he found a dramatic drop in post-birth infection rates. And he wrote about this, and he really got piled on by the doctors who said that's nonsense. We couldn't possibly be the source of the infection. We're too clean and upstanding for that. He really did not. He did not get a good response. The doctor who really starts to break through that denial, as it were, is Joseph Lister, surgeon. It developed a new way of doing surgery to minimize the germs and post-op infection. And like Semmelweis, he found by disinfecting during the operation that he was able to lower the post-op infections dramatically.
Was that his main contribution, Lister?
Yep. Surgical antiseptic surgery. There's still a lot of medical resistance to it. One of the most interesting turning points in the United States in kind of accepting that hands had germs that could kill was the aftermath of the assassination attempt on James Garfield. It's a really horrific story. He's shot by a deranged man in the Washington train station, and the doctors who initially examine him stick their fingers in the path of the bullet because they're trying to find the bullet. Then they introduce probes, and basically poor Garfield would have survived the gunshot, but he could not survive the massive infection. So there was a huge debate, and they called in medical experts, and basically the surgeons who had said, oh, this Lister stuff is nonsense, they were converted. The Garfield horror really convinced them that they needed to start taking more precautions. And what surgeons start to do in the 1830s and 1890s then kind of goes over into the public. The idea that, well, everybody needs to be clean in a new kind of way.
What do you think about what's happening now, at least in the health field, where they're appreciating germs, good bacteria, healthy bacteria, and that our body's made of more bacteria than human cells?
That is such a good point to bring up, and it's something I think about a lot, because so much of public health and then later medicine, when they do get antibiotics, is to declare war on all your microbes, and the failure to distinguish between the ones that help you from the ones that harm you. I found in my readings that very early, the experts in the microbial world do try to explain to the public there are good bacteria. There are bacteria you need to make your food. They're less aware early on of how much microbial flora and fauna we have in our own bodies. That is a more, I think, recent revelation. But I agree. I think at the same time, we need to learn how to protect ourselves against the coronavirus. We need to learn how to become more gentle and kind to the good microfauna in our bodies.
Right. They talk about people who live in like really sterile environments. They're more susceptible because they're.
Yeah.
So there has to be another public awareness
Yes.
around the
Yeah.
acceptance of germs.
You put your finger on hitting that balance is very difficult because a coronavirus is not something you want happy. And we're not talking about viruses. We're talking about other, other kinds of microbes that are commensal. I think is that the fancy word for it, where they help us.
Because we've gone too far the other way, and that's still kind of a public awareness. I mean, just the fact that they, in the 50s, at least when I was 50s and 60s, they would tell women to bottle feed their babies instead of breastfeeding.
Yep. And it was out of this, worry about sterility. But in fact, well, first the breastfeeding passes on initial immunity. So you want mothers to do it. But also, you probably heard of the hygiene hypothesis. It's the idea that in modern antiseptic, aseptic life, we don't have enough exposure to viruses and bacteria, and our immune system doesn't have enough to do. And that is one reason we have more autoimmune disorders.
What do you say about how dangerous hospitals are? Someone who can get bacteria very easily there. Is there a public health policy for that?
Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, everyone knows it's a problem. It's just what to do about it. And a lot of the difficulties in hospitals is they're a perfect place for resistant bacteria to thrive and then affect very fragile people. It's really a difficult problem to combat because these the kind of cleanliness that you need to like completely rid a hospital of MRSA is really difficult, and it can lurk in places that you don't even suspect.
So the best thing, I guess, for everything is just make sure to keep your immune system
Yes,
strong.
that has long been one of what I learned by doing all my research on the germ theory was take care of your immune system and try. I if I need to go to the hospital, I will go to the hospital, but I try to stay out of them as much as possible.
One more thing I want to talk to you about in terms of what's happening now is what you mentioned before, the mental awareness, the stress, because it's changed our social interaction. What do you see from that perspective?
I've been thinking about this. If I go back, I mean, both my parents were alive in 1918. They were very little children, but they lived in a world where people dying, including from infectious diseases, was still just part of life. And so I think the expectation then that you shouldn't die from scary things, people were more accepting of that than we are today. Today, we kind of, I think, have more of an expectation that everything can be cured, even though it can't, clearly. And that makes it more anxiety producing. We don't have the same coping skills that you just had to have back in the pandemic flu days.
And tuberculosis, of course, was big.
Yes, yeah, very common, and all kinds of childhood diseases were very common. So parents were still losing children to infectious diseases. That was a common experience for a lot of people. And when something is common, you do develop rituals. You don't have this picture of the world that it should be completely controllable. So that's one thing I'd call out. The other is that even though they had more media coverage of the pandemic than of any epidemic before that, it was still not 24/7. You might read about it in the newspaper, but you didn't have a television, there was no radio. There was still more distance.
Yeah, you can look at this thing 24 hours a day on.
Absolutely. It's just insane. Not and so I think in terms of a mental health piece of it, the Spanish influenza was a trauma for the nation, but it was also occurring at wartime, and the war had been a trauma. After the war it was a difficult time. So it's hard to. I don't want to say that the Spanish influenza wasn't a downer. It was, but it was part of a kind of bigger picture of things going wrong. Now, fast forward to today, as you say, we have many more sources coming at us, and a lot more disagreement. So you're constantly having to decide, is this crazy? Is this reliable? You have so many information sources. Who are you going to believe? And then I'd say I'd layer it on top of, there has been an upsurge in probably the last 15, 20 years, especially among young people, of anxiety disorders.
Yeah.
And this pandemic, which is anxiety producing to anybody, I think is going to take a particular toll on people who are already very anxious, and there are a lot of them out there. So I think there's going to be a real mental health challenge in kind of helping people who are just become so fearful. I've been talking to a lot of them this week who really are acting as if this is the bubonic plague, and it's not, and sort of getting bent out of shape about the lots of stuff that I'm like, no, it's not that bad.
I mean, like the hysteria around this is even bigger than it was in 1918, 19.
I can't say that, because that was that in a way you could say the panic in 1918 was really warranted, because a lot of people were dying. The death rate was so much higher, young people dying. I can't really accuse them of overreacting. I don't want to accuse us of overreacting.
You go out in the street, it's a whole different reality out there.
I've never seen anything like it. It feels a little bit like after 9/11.
Except you can't hug people now.
But you can't hug people. The streets are empty, and the panic buying. I'm trying to be gentle in my reaction to this and say to myself, okay, if it makes people calmer to go buy toilet paper, okay. In the scale of what disturbs me about the current reaction, I am less bothered about people doing panic buying of stuff like toilet paper, and much more bothered by the way this becomes an open door for racism.
Oh, against Chinese, you say?
Oh, unbelievable. And it's so striking to me. I don't hear any of this. Oh, now we're going to target everybody who's Italian. It seems so incredibly racist the way it's being cast.
I wasn't aware there was that level of.
Oh yeah.
Against Chinese, if you're just look Chinese.
Even if you are an Asian American who has never been anywhere in Asia in your life. We hear this. We have a lot of Asian students on our campus, and some of them are international students, but a lot of them are as American as I am, born in the States.
Born here for generation. Yeah.
Exactly. And people are acting weird with them. It's just the dark side gets unleashed without a lot of provocation. So I would say, in terms of what I would like to see vigilance about and people to behave better, I would not focus on stop the panic buying. That doesn't seem like a huge problem. We're not going to run out of food or toilet paper. Uh, we do need to really be vigilant about our prejudices getting loose here.
It seems like we always need a Firmacos.
Scapegoat.
Scapegoat, yes, exactly.
Pandemics have produced scapegoats throughout history. The Jews and the bubonic plague were
Because they took more baths than other people, I think.
I just heard we had a podcast yesterday, and one of the Stony Brook faculty is under self-imposed quarantine in New Rochelle. And she was saying she had been very disturbed about the anti-Semitism there because the outbreak was kind of centered, I guess, on a synagogue. She was really seeing some very ugly stuff. So that's what I mean about it becoming an invitation for our worst impulses.
Instead of trying to help each other and come
Yeah.
together. But there's one more thing that I see in your history that I really do want to talk to you about, which is your book, The Remaking of the American Patient, how Madison Avenue turned modern medicine towards patients into consumers.
Yes.
Is that what we're suffering now, where people immediately see a commercial, run to a doctor? Talk about that thesis a little bit, because that's fascinating.
Well, it is certainly an element of what's going wrong right now, but I'd bring it back to the concept of public health, and what we need to protect the public is not easily deliverable as a market-based good. If you leave it up to the free market, how are you going to get people to invest in sewers for everybody? It's a kind of public good that needs to be built into the system and taken care of apart from the ability of this or that business to make money. So I heard the example yesterday, very striking, of the SARS epidemic. That was worse than the coronavirus in terms of the number of people who died. Someone actually developed a vaccine against SARS and couldn't find a pharmaceutical company interested in producing it because the epidemic was gone. So that, I think we have gone too far in monetarizing everything and making it all about markets and choices. I mean, that works moderately well in some areas, but it's not a good way to run your healthcare system.
No, it's awful, the price of pharmaceuticals. There's one pharmaceutical my stepfather has to take, and that's $400 because that's some people just can't afford that.
It's gouging.
Don't you think the government needs to step in? I mean, that's why I like Bernie Sanders, because it's all about, the health of the person, not the profits of corporations.
Absolutely. But Alan, what's been interesting for me since I wrote that book came out in 2016, I've been invited to go to Europe to talk, in part because these are capitalist countries that have stronger welfare systems and also national health services, and they do it in a lot of different ways. And they're interested in talking to me because basically they want to protect what they have and to keep it from going off the rails. And it's just striking to me, even if you want to have a strong capitalist democratic nation, you need public health, and that I'm much more sympathetic to the Sanders position than I am to a conservative Republican position on healthcare. But it's just to me it doesn't even make sense for conservatives to be as blind to the need to have taxes that go into not public health infrastructure, but lots of things. This idea that, all of us who are not one percenters should be out there financing our own vaccines or our own whatever.
It's a crime.
Yeah,
It's a high collar crime.
indeed, indeed.
If we don't have public health, we're not going to have a public.
Amen. Amen, brother. That is well said.
But just one more. How did Madison Avenue turn this obsession with medicine into consumer? Because this is a...
Well, unfortunately they had some help from. There were a lot of businesses that saw the potential to commercialize health, and it goes way back to the 19th century, to the beginnings of the pharmaceutical industry, the patent medicine, and the advertising of tonics for, this will cure everything that ails you. So Americans, we've had a really robust commercialized relationship with health, going way back, and it's just gotten increasingly more sophisticated over the last century.
Greedy, let's call it.
Amen. Yep.
Well, thanks for doing what you're doing. Let's do a follow-up as this thing passes.
Cool. Great idea. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Nancy. Nancy Toms is a professor at Stony Brook of history. You also have a Wikipedia page, which is very impressive.
I didn't even know I did.
American historian, author, distinguished professor at Stony Brook. She was awarded the Ben Croft Prize in 2017 for the remaking of The American Patient. Attended Oberlin College.
I did.
First co-ed college.
First to admit African Americans as well, women and African Americans.
Also, my old friend Bud Hopkins went there. You know who Bud Hopkins is?
Yeah.
First to talk about alien abduction.
Well, I saw you have a podcast about that. I'm going to go listen to it.
Yes, I have lots of stuff.
It looks very interesting. Yeah.
They're not going to save us, but we need to be aware that we're part of a greater environment, if you want to call it that, a greater cosmos. We're not just an isolated germ planet. Actually, there was a germ who actually lived on one of those Apollo land. But anyway, life is abundant throughout the universe, and I think we need to take care of life here. Maybe I'll give a lecture at Stony Brook about the history.
Hey, okay.
Let me know about that, because I have a whole history of the contact experience and what that means in terms of...
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go check that out. Yeah.
Any final words you want to say?
Be calm and be kind. That's what I'm getting up every morning and saying to myself. Wash your hands.
Right, wash your hands and don't touch your face. But it's not as bad as the media, if you watch it 24 hours, wants to tell you also.
As with everything, take it with a grain of salt. Balance is good.
When do you expect it to pass? That's what. Do you have any?
So again, I'm just repeating the latest I've heard is they don't know. They're hoping that it'll be seasonal in the sense that it will die down as the weather gets warmer, but they're not sure because it's a novel. They don't know what it's going to do. It could die down and then it could come back again in the fall. So I think we're probably going to be talking about coronavirus for a while longer.
Lisa, but yeah, all right. I think it wouldn't last more than a few months. This hysteria, though.
Hysteria will die down because you can't stay hysterical every minute of the day. So yes, I think that will settle down.
This is Alan Steinfeld for New Realities. You've been listening to Professor Nancy Toms from Stony Brook University, a history professor there. I'll be doing some updates, and if you want to know more about New Realities, go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/New Realities. Thanks for listening. Be safe.